All right, well, I think we'll get started. It's 1:30. We're here today to talk about letting Iris do the work with Git source control and linting ObjectScript across editors. I know I asked the question earlier as some people were still filtering in. Who is still primarily using Studio? Wow. Who's primarily using VS Code? Okay, interesting. Who has no source control strategy at all? I'm sorry. So I'm Tim Leavitt. I'm the development manager in application services at InterSystems.
I'm Sarmishta Velury, and I'm a developer with application services at InterSystems.
So just by way of introduction, Iris is really unique in that your code also lives in the database, and you can work with your code like you would work with data. You can programmatically generate code, and I think these are really this is really one of the key things, along with the combination object relational multi-model aspects of Iris that make it so unique. The ability that you can work with your code as data. So along these lines, there are IDE extensions that work in both Studio and VS Code and worked in Atelier that facilitate collaboration for users working in a shared remote environment, or even if you're using Studio, you really need these extensions in place to do source control effectively. Rather than just doing a manual export of classes as XML and then you pull them in from somewhere else. That way you can make it so that when you make changes in the IDE, they automatically go out to disk. Really, in the modern world, it'd be way better to have local development environment, VS Code, containers maybe, and that's really something to strive for. And using a local Git repo, for example, is absolutely what I would recommend. But for those of you in the meanwhile, this is a good way to perhaps even ease the transition to that kind of best practice approach. So we're going to highlight two extensions that run on the server as you're editing code through Studio and VS Code that are available on the Open Exchange that help with collaboration. The first of these I talked about at our virtual summit last year is a Git source control extension. Over the past year, well, not even a year, Sarmishta has done some great work on that, and we've had some great collaboration with several of you from the community, and we'd really like to keep that going. So we'll show off what we've done over the past year. We also have a new thing that we've released called Codetidy that we stole from Nathan Keast in the back and Track Care Development, and we're making this available as well to help provide consistent code formatting. I know in some of the applications we work on that are 20 years old, that have had 10 different developers over that time, kind of feels like they have multiple personalities going on. And we try to suppress the old dot syntax personalities, but for everything else, we can use this kind of tool to provide a consistent appearance of code across the application, which just makes it a lot easier to navigate and contribute to. So coming out of this, you should have a better idea of how to collaborate in a shared development environment, which I know is especially common in a healthcare setting with Git, and also how to automate code standards enforcement for ObjectScript using Codetidy.
So I'm going to talk about Git source control. Now, as a show of hands, how many here use Git every day? How many of you want to use Git with Iris? Okay, great. So hopefully you'll find this valuable. So as Tim mentioned, we presented on this during the last Global Summit. Now, because Iris has code that lives both in the server and locally, it makes using Git a little bit complicated because Git just looks at your local file system. And so we solved that problem with this extension. To get started, it's pretty simple. You can install it either using CPM, which I think is the easiest way to do it. So just CPM install Git source control. Or if you want all of the latest features that we have developed, but they aren't released yet. So you can clone the repository from GitHub and then load it using CPM. There are a few settings that you need to do. And this method, you can run this command, and this method will walk you through all of those settings that you need to do. Now, if you need to look at those settings, modify them, there is a nice web UI, which you can also look at. And it's a little bit more user-friendly than the method. And one last thing you need to do is you need to configure ISFS server-side code editing on VS Code if you're using that. So some of the features that we have in this extension are like the biggest feature and the most important one, I think, is that it very simply syncs changes and source control operations back to Iris. And this is really what enables all of the other features that we have. And this is sort of the finicky bit of working with Git when you're using Iris. And so we support all of the major source control operations: add, remove, commit, push, pull, and fetch from the remote. Branching, so that's checking out, merging, deleting branches, both local and remote branches, and stashing changes, applying, popping, and dropping them. Pull event handlers, I think, are a really cool feature that we offer. So when you execute a git pull operation, you have code-based changes that need to be synced back to the server in a way that makes sense for you. So these could be file additions, file deletions, database changes. All of these need to be communicated back in a way that makes sense, and the pull event handlers can do that for you. We ship with 2 pull event handlers that I'll show you how they work a little bit later. The extension is also package manager aware, and so this means that if you have multiple repositories on the same Iris instance, you don't have to worry about making sure that the files go back to the correct repository. The package manager handles all of that for you, and it's pretty seamless. As Tim mentioned, one thing that we've tried to incorporate is making support for multiple users sharing a development environment. And to that end, we have built in a few safeguards to try and prevent mistakes from happening. So hopefully you won't edit someone else's code that they've already edited. You won't commit someone else's changes. We've also tried to make sure attribution is correct so that in case there's an issue with the code, you can speak to the right person and things like that. Now we look at a few demos. So first we look at the install. I have videos of the demos here because I need to do some setup to make sure that the demos work as they should, and that would have really gone quite over. So to install it, just do a ZPM install, and the installation method helpfully shows you the command that you need to do to configure the settings. Unfortunately, I can't. I'm limited now. Sorry. Yeah, so I've copy pasted the command here, and so you have to enter the path to your Git executable, the root of the Git repository that you want to work with, which is what I'm doing here. You can also enter the path to your SSH key if you want to work with remotes, which I'm skipping here, and there's configurations for exporting % classes. And right now I'm entering details to make sure that all code that I write is attributed back to me. Sorry. Right, okay. And it also comes with a few default settings, so things like mappings and everything, so that you don't have to start from scratch. We'll now look at the settings page that I was talking about and add a mapping for HL7 files. Because abstract document types are one of the types that we also work with. And yes, so to launch the settings page, just click the right-hand button, select settings from the drop-down, and these are all of the settings that we had configured before. Right now I'm adding an HL7 mapping, so to do that I just entered HL7. The star indicates that I want to have all files of the HL7 file type mapped to the HL7 folder, and this is relative to the repository root. You'll also see that some of the text boxes have like a green check mark next to them, and that's just simple validation. It just makes sure that in the case of the Git executable, that the Git executable actually exists, and it prints out the version of the Git executable for you. In case of the SSH private key file, it makes sure that that file actually exists on the path that you've entered. Right now, the extension also ships with what I think is a pretty cool web UI, and so I want to show that off now. And we also use it further down in the demos, so going over it will be, I think, useful right now. So to do that, we just again click the right-hand side button, launch Git UI, and this takes you to the web UI. Now, the web UI opens by default to the current branch. It shows the commit history of the current branch on the left-hand side. And as you click through all of the commits, it'll show the details of the commits on the right-hand side. You can see all of the changes, commit message, etc. If you want to explore this in more detail, you can see the changes file by file if you click the explore button. You can also look at other local branches. You can check out branches, merge, delete branches, etc. Here I've checked out a different local branch. You can again do everything that I talked about in all of the other local branches as well. We also offer some support for remote branches, so you can check them out, merge them, etc. Now let's take a look at the stash. So this window shows you all of the changes that you have stashed up till now, and on the right hand side it shows those stash changes. So from the right hand side menu you can apply, pop, or drop any of these changes. Here I've applied one of the stash changes. Now I go to the workspace and we see that the changes that I applied are there in the workspace. So the workspace is really where I think you'll spend most of your time, because from here you can see all of the changes that have been made, whether they have been staged or they're ready for staging. From there you can stage these changes and commit them, or you can stash them, or you can discard them if you don't need them anymore. And right now I'm just going to stash these changes because I don't need them. Okay. Now for this demo, I made a project called a demo project, which has a class demo class 2. And I want to add this to source control. So to do that, I right-click demo class 2, select server-side source control, and select add. And you'll see that demo class 2 now appears on the file system there on top, and it was also added to Git. I should have asked this before, but can you see the thing? No.
So all the slides are in the presentation, or all the slides are in the event app, so you should be able to get to that there, and it'll be a little more readable.
Right, okay. Now that we have added these changes, I want to commit them. So I think the simplest way to do that is to go through the web UI. As you can see, the change that we added is already staged. And so I just add a commit message and click commit, and it commits these changes. I want to push this now to the remote, but before that, I want to make sure that there aren't any changes that are there on the remote that I need to pull. So I'll first do a git pull. And here you can see sort of what the pull event handler does. So we use $ZF to execute all of these Git commands, and that means that you get back the same response that Git gave you. And so if you've used Git before, then this is this is pretty good because you know exactly what you're seeing. And here there is a file that was added called demo class 3. And so the pull event handler, it realized that there was a file that was added, compiled it, and imported it into Iris, and then Iris compiled it. I'm sorry. Okay, now now I want to show off a little bit of the shared development instance features. And so let's take a scenario where I made some changes, I didn't commit them, and I went away and not accessible anymore. So a different user called, say, user 3 wants to take some of my changes and use them for their work. And so if they try to do that, after they log in, if they try to do that, the extension stops them. If you can see, they're trying to press enter, it doesn't let them make any edits. So they go to the web UI, go to the workspace, and they then can stage or stash. So I want to point one thing out here. Right, okay. So I don't know how far this is visible, I'm sorry about that, but do you see the little icon on the left of the files? That doesn't appear on all of the files. Basically, what the icon indicates is that those changes were made by a different user. And so it's a really easy visual way of telling which changes are yours and which changes are someone else's. And so, so now that user 3 wants to commit these changes, and they're adding a commit message, and they're committing them. They want to stash the changes, the other demo class 1 changes, because they don't need them anymore. Now, because these changes were made by a different user, the extension realizes that that's what's happening and wants to make sure that they indeed want to change, indeed want to stash someone else's changes, because it could be that you did by mistake. And so it pops up a dialog confirming that you want to stash it. If you don't want to, you can click cancel and that's fine. Yeah. And then stash it, go back, and then user 3 creates a new branch, and they can continue their work from the current head, split off into a new branch. Yeah. User 3 also has an HL7 file that they want to add. So to do that, they go to the management portal, navigate to the HL7 schema menu, and then there's a similar menu that pops up here on the right hand to the one that's on VS Code, and they select add for test schema. Oh my god, sorry. Yes, okay. Yeah, so they select add for the test schema, and the test schema then gets added to source control, and it's exported out to the root repository /hl7/test schema.hl7, which is how we configured it in the mappings. Yeah, that's all I have for git source control. That's just, yeah, you can go ahead.
All right. So have you guys seen or worked with things like that before in Studio in the management portal, or is this something brand new like that you haven't seen? Just curious. Who's worked with source control extensions like this before?
Does that actually work in Studio? Because we only saw VS Code, right?
Yeah, it works in Studio too. Everybody should be, I think everybody should be using VS Code. A lot of people at InterSystems believe that, and it's definitely, it's come a long way. If you tried it a year or two ago, like it's totally different now versus then.
It's not in 2020 version though, right?
Yeah, you can.
You can.
The latest cache release was 2018, but so, I mean, Studio is still shipping with the product at this point for everything. Huh. Okay. So the short answer is yes, it works in Studio too. Just for demos, we want to use VS Code. So on to the next extension. It's called CodeTidy. It's installed similarly from the Open Exchange, and I'm just going to go right into a demo pretty soon on this. So you can either use the package manager to install or clone and use the package manager to load. So this does require Iris at an earliest version. For the Git source control extension, we are looking into, it's on our roadmap to support earlier cache ensemble releases as well. We don't have an estimate on that yet, but if that's important to you, just talk to us after so we know that there's interest. So in terms of setup for CodeTidy, and really the point of CodeTidy, as I said at the beginning, is to make your code look prettier, to enforce consistent standards for code formatting for everybody connecting to the environment and sending their code there. So you can configure this alongside whatever existing source control extension you're using. You'll get both menus, a menu for your source control extension or whatever menus it contributes, and also a menu for CodeTidy specifically, and the behavior of both of those at the same time. So the first method just says, set this as the source control class for the namespace alongside the existing source control class if there is one. And then you can configure settings for it to say exactly what things you want to do to make your code prettier. What it's able to do is just general document parsing and making changes based on that. So it can tell the difference between a variable named set and the set command, for example. It fixes indentation to apply a consistent format across the whole code base. It can format all variable and so system variable and system and function names to follow guidelines. So instead of, I think I have an old version of this presentation. Oh no. So this is, Yeah. So this is really like your $P instead of changing that to $piece, dollar extract instead of $E, and so on, or expanding commands from the short one-letter form to the full command, which just really helps for code readability. Can also warn the user about deprecated methods, suboptimal code patterns, and just better approaches for doing the same thing. And it works with a variety of file types with classes and routines. And there's even some support for JavaScript in there. So I'll go over to a quick demo of this. And this demo is just going to be on my actual machine. So a quick note on VS Code as a start. This ISFS editing mode, if you have the latest, greatest, all the extensions.
Since you're doing this live, can you just zoom up the
Yes.
font size?
Yep. Thank you. One more. All right, that should be much better. So I can see I have all these folders in my VS Code workspace. If I look at InterSystems tools, I can see all the servers that I have, which, because my team manages a dozen different applications, each of which has 3 environments, within InterSystems, that's a lot. If I had all these in my Windows Server registry, I could just say InterSystems Server Manager import servers from Windows Registry, and what I have in my cube will just pop into VS Code magically. There might be some tweaks needed there, particularly wacky things around making sure you have the right HTTPS settings or port or things like that, depending on your Iris version that you're targeting. So right now, I just have my default Iris instance on that I'm running locally. I can see I have a bunch of namespaces here. And if I want to say edit code in a namespace there, I can just say edit, and it gets added to my workspace, and I can see all the code in that namespace. So for a server-centric editing mode in VS Code, this may be better. I was talking to someone earlier today who hadn't seen this before, who was going around messing with different server settings and just changing a single connection for the workspace. And really, this is so much better if you are in a server-centric development mode. So this is also, there's a workspace settings file that's just JSON, and you can see this is how the folders are defined when you go and add that. And if you want to really customize things, you can do that. So I just want to highlight this in case you haven't seen that latest, greatest in VS Code. The other complaint that I got from someone is I keep having to enter my password all the time over and over again. So just in case this is news to you, you can also say store password in keychain or clear password from keychain if you've changed it or it needs to change. And this just, working with VS Code is so much better than it was a couple years ago for ObjectScript, and I'm using it probably 80% right now, still Studio for some things. But really, if you tried it and gave up on it, give it another try. So anyway, on to actual code-tidy. I can see this source control icon that has my Git menu that we saw before. And there's also this server command menu, and right now there's nothing there. So I'm going to go over here and I'll say ZPM, and this, unfortunately, I don't think I can make much bigger. Nope, that worked.
Yeah.
So I can say ZPM install isc-codetidy. I guess another good point to step back. Who is familiar with, who knows what ZPM means? ZPM, that command there. So that's the InterSystems package manager, and it's really a key driver behind a lot of the things we're doing in the community right now. I live in this all the time, so I just assume everybody has that context sometimes, but it's really, really something transformational, and I'd recommend, there's tons of resources out on the developer community about it if you'd like to learn more, and weren't able to make it to the experience labs this week. So I'll just say install isc-codetidy. Oh, not that, isc.codetidy. It's a real live demo. And that'll go out to the Open Exchange to pm.community.intersystems.com and pull down some ObjectScript and load it in my namespace. And then I can run those methods to say, configure the extension. So I'll say, there's the option to automatically format when a document is saved to the server. So I'm going to leave that as no just to demonstrate what it looks like formatting it manually. But you could just say, anytime someone syncs a class up to the server, force correct formatting on it. Resequence class members is an option that will put parameters, then properties, then indices, then methods. It's a pet peeve of mine when I'm looking at a class and someone has a bunch of methods and then there's some extra properties hiding down underneath it that it's like, I didn't even know those were there. So this is just a really good thing for readability of classes. Auto-indent documents is straightforward, and there's an option to say I want to use tabs or I want to use some number of spaces to indent, depending on what your preference is. And I know there are a lot of strong opinions about that either way. Tab is clearly the right answer, so I don't know why there are strong opinions. There's also an option to look for common mistakes and inefficiencies. So an example here, it's really more a code style thing, and down the road we'll be looking to make this a little bit more customizable to be able to define your own and say, no, I actually disagree with that because there are so many different opinions on what good ObjectScript looks like. So an example of this would be, from a performance perspective, it's better to say $get of %session.data is some variable than %session.get some string to get a key from a CSP session, for example. So that's something that we can say, we'll find that, and when you compile your class, we'll point it out to you. And we can even say optionally fix these things rather than just warning about them. There's also an option to enforce consistent command function system variable case. So all caps right, I think everybody can agree is wrong. But there's kind of a difference in opinion. You know, should you have all lowercase, or some people really like Pascal case for readability, especially for functions. That's me. I've spent too much time reading Joe DeSantis's code. So that's also an option to use Pascal case. There's also an option to convert all comments to macro comments, the benefit there being that when you compile the code, those comments are not retained in the int code. So it takes up a little bit less space if you care about those things. And we'll leave that on. There's also an option to use ESLint, which is an external library for JavaScript. I'm not going to bother with that right now. And you can configure packages and classes and % classes. Packages and classes not to format, % classes to format. For example, if you have %z classes, normally those would be ignored, but you can say, I actually do want to format these. And then we will generally issue a warning if you're doing direct global references, but maybe there are a couple globals that you'll reference directly, like a temp global, or you really do, well, best avoided, but for some applications, there may be some of those that are so entrenched that you don't want to go changing it, so you can configure an exclusion list here. So now that I've done that, I'll go back to VS Code. And I've got this really ugly looking class that has an index up here, and a property down here, parameter down at the bottom, inconsistent tabs and spacing in this method. I've got a direct global reference. I've got short command and function names. I'm using %session.get. I have a comment that says, to do, this is a hack, shouldn't do this. So when I say, which namespace am I in? I'm in Git. I am in Git. Uh-oh. I didn't run the setup extension method. That's what happened. So now that I've configured it, I'm actually going to say I want to enable this extension in the namespace. And it'll set it up with some fancy stuff to run alongside the existing source control extension that I already have running in the namespace. So when I go up to that Git menu, it's still there, but when I go to the server command menu, I also have the option to run codetidy. And when I do that, magically my class looks much better. And that could be made automatic. I haven't for demonstration purposes. And there's also a bunch of things that show up in the output from running that. there's a missing class description and a missing method description, and for maintainability of code, those are really good things to have. It's flagged that there's a to-do and there's something that says hack, and those are things that should probably be dealt with at some point. It's advised me that from a performance perspective, it's better to use $$get of %session.data rather than %session.get, which is getting a multidimensional property as opposed to calling a method, which is just inherently more expensive. And then it's warning me about my direct global reference. So that's just a quick snapshot of what git-source-control can do for you. We're looking to continue to build this out over time as my team's using it, and to continue to fold in work that the track care development team is doing on their version of it. I saw a question, yes?
The new developer has to do this, applicable for all the.
So the point of putting it on the server is if you have 15 developers connecting to the server, it applies to all of them, and you don't have to do separate configuration for all of them. I know I think on occasion seen inconsistent use of client-side formatting for Angular code on my team, and it doesn't really do any good if only one person is using something that automatically makes the code prettier because someone else comes in and edits things and isn't running that, and it's a problem.
Is
Yeah.
git-source-control working on studio also?
Yes. So I'll just I'll go back to the old version of this, and we can demonstrate. I'll pull up Studio on my local Iris instance. We'll change over to the Git namespace. As opposed to in VS Code, I just had all the namespaces right there. So I'll pull up that same class, sample.toFormat, and I'll say git-source-control run, and the same thing happens. So, and the menus, and it's all equivalent behavior between Studio and VS Code.
I can't quite see. Git-source-control is a menu item?
Yep, there's I don't know if I can zoom that in. Yes, so there's a menu called Git, and there's a menu called git-source-control. That same thing also shows up in VS Code if I say server command menu. It's run from the git-source-control menu and run on files and source control from the git-source-control menu. Yep, and that's based on the server-side configuration of the environment that you're connecting to. So next steps, and we've got plenty of time for questions, which I'm glad about because we've already had a bunch and I'm sure there are more. So next steps, I'd say try these things out from the Open Exchange. Give us your feedback. We've had great, helpful, constructive feedback from customers who have tried running with this since last year, and we're eager for more, and we're eager to help you keep your source code safer and prettier and help you collaborate with your team. And feel free to connect with us. I have a prettier LinkedIn link now, but didn't make it onto the slide. Feel free to connect with us here or through email. We all have very predictable email addresses at InterSystems. And thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so we have an environment where our namespace is not straightforward. It's made up of various different databases that divide the data and the code. It's basically a licensed product, so we have to do these things for distribution. But that gives us a challenge when we're trying to do enhancements where you really do need code isolation. Your enhancement could take a few days, and in those few days, your code is broken. If somebody else runs that code, it's going to mess them up. So currently, developers are developing against a shared development environment. And with VS Code, when you're compiling against that namespace. And since you're doing an enhancement, you're basically in an unstable state until that's complete. So we also have the concept of pull requests, and we have Git, but that's going through TFS. So the owner has a chance. We basically have a review process before something gets either committed or not. So what we would like to do is to have the local namespace where you can break it as much as you like. You can break it completely and then restore. And once it's committed to Git and then it's approved, then it's pushed to some sort of shared development environment or shared test environment. So I noticed that you have like a pull.
Yep.
There's a sync, a pull, a push, and a stash. So
Yep.
are any of those where you can actually, once you're done with your enhancement and you've touched, say, 2 or 3 or 4 routines or classes, where you can actually pull back to your local repository all the changes that are in, say, in your central development namespace? And that's important because I may have touched like 10 routines and all that, but I need to get whatever is out there on my local namespace that has been added since that point. And I don't know if any of this would allow me to do that, or do I have to now resort to restoring a backup of a namespace?
Okay, so you have say a dev branch, and then you're doing work on individual features and feature branches, and as a developer you've been working in a feature branch for a couple days and other changes have gone into the dev branch that you're based off of, and you want to get those changes. Is that what you're talking about?
More importantly, I've done this work on a local namespace because I don't want to break anybody else's namespace. So
namespace on your local machine.
right, your namespace is on the local
So
machine. Yeah.
So your developers have local development environments on
Not
their own?
everybody. I do.
Okay.
But I would like to promote that as an additional steps to create that additional level of isolation. One of the problems with developing in a central namespace is developers more apprehensive, right?
Yeah.
They really have to be careful, right? And it's difficult to do enhancements because you're gonna break the code for a period of 5 days. So by using a local namespace, you can crash, you can do whatever you want with it, and you have sufficient isolation from the rest of the developers.
Yeah, well, I would definitely say that the right thing to do is to, if you can, have developers have their own local environment that's just theirs that they can break as much as they want. And really Git should work well for that workflow, kind of in different branches with different levels of stability, where maybe there's main, test, dev, and then feature branches based off of dev.
That's true, but I have a way to do sync with Git. So all the changes that are in a particular branch are pulled into my local Git repository. That's Git. That's version source control. But what I need is my namespace to also have that same function. I want to be able to pull in everything that's in a central namespace into my local.
So that would be the use case for the pull event handler to say, you know, I got these diff chunks from Git. These are the files that were changed. They've been changed on the file system. We need to load them into the database as well, or maybe even delete things.
And then compile and make sure that
and compile and
that's the pull.
That would be the pull event handler. So you can define your own class that says after a Git pull, what happens, and that would, I mean, that you'd also be merging there. So I'm not sure if we.
So the git pull event handler just identifies which files have been changed. Of those files, which files need to be imported back into Iris and then recompiled. And once we have that determined, regardless of what the changes are, whether it's an addition, deletion, merge, whatever it may be, those files are then recompiled. So you don't recompile your whole package, just the files that were changed.
Does InterSystems, does the extension do that for us, or do we have to do custom code in the event, in the handlers?
It does it for you. If you wanted to say something like, you know, after a pull, we have this data that's kind of like code and we want to reload that. Or we have this, we want to restart the production after compiling everything or something like that. That would be an area for customization. I think another thing that I would generally point you to is the package manager, because that's a good way to say, you know, you have a collection of files that are part of your application. Where are they? What format are they in? How do you, say, go from a brand new empty instance or even a container and say, load everything that is my application in a simple and reusable way? And that's something that the package manager is very useful for.
Okay. I mean, we have packages with 1,000 classes. I mean,
right, so you don't want to.
It's really like complicated.
So I think the key thing with the pull event handler is it's incremental. It's not going to reload and recompile the whole thing every time. There are features to help you do that if you want to, but it is inherently incremental, and that I think would be really useful.
Okay, and just one more thing. If you go back to VS Code, can you show us the extensions that are applicable to what you're showing? Because you have like 36 things in there. Which ones are the ones that we're talking about in this?
So in VS Code, if you want to work with ObjectScript from VS Code, you really want the InterSystems ObjectScript extension pack. That has 3 extensions: the language server, the base ObjectScript extension, and the server manager. So
Sorry, what was that first?
the language server,
What is that?
that handles like syntax coloring and interpretation and stuff.
Oh, so it's like optional.
John, you can speak to this better than I can.
You wouldn't want to do without, if you want your code colored. Yeah, so I'm John Murray. I'm one of the developers of VS Code extensions that Tim's been showing here. Language server is doing the code coloring there. It will provide the code completion. So when you start typing something, it will say, these are perhaps some of the methods that you want to choose. If you don't have language server, you're coding with at least one hand tied behind your back. There's no reason not to have language server. You have to have the ObjectScript extension. Server manager is kind of optional, but as Tim showed you there, if you're dealing with more than one namespace or on a single server or even more than one server, it's a whole load easier just to have it. It's like what you're used to on the cube of saying, you know, this is my preferred server at the moment, but actually I now need to connect to this one and so forth. But install the ObjectScript extension pack that brings in all 3 of them, and you're good to go there.
Other questions?
Just in relation to the business about local developer namespace, don't interpret that as meaning you've got to run an instance of Iris on your local machine.
Right.
You can equally well say we have a shared resource server there, and we have a personal namespace each on there, and that gives you the code isolation. But it also means that you're not reliant on. Okay. Yeah, it means you're not then reliant on the individual developer to get their local environment backed up. You know, if you've got 10 developers, 6 of them are good at getting their machine backed up, 3 of them are a bit lazy about it, and then somebody leaves their laptop in the coffee shop. Where's the backup?
So I think one thing that I would like to point out, what is definitely not okay is having a shared remote environment with multiple developers treating their own local file system on their machine as the source of truth, because you're going to be stomping on each other. So that's not an option. Having dedicated per developer local or remote instances is good. Having a shared remote instance with something like the git-source-control extension to provide that concurrency control so you don't have people connecting and stomping on each other working in the same namespace is also an option. And within my team, we use all of the valid options there. Yes?
I don't know if this thing's actually working or not. But,
Oh,
yeah,
there we
it is.
go.
So with the Git plugin, it seems like you're replacing what would be some sort of platform like GitHub or GitLab, and now you're doing everything locally.
Well, no.
So-
So that
Oh, go ahead.
you always have a local repository when you're working with Git.
Right.
So it's just a matter of which remote are you pushing and pulling from? It could be GitHub, could be GitLab, could be Microsoft's Azure Git thing.
Sure.
Could
So
be
I
Bitbucket.
guess the question is, if it's specific to this instance, though, how do we migrate the code? You know, so if we're developing in our low-tier dev environment, right, how do we get that to, test?
Right. So you perhaps I would say maybe have a branch per environment. So you have a dev branch, you have a test branch, you have maybe main represents what's in production, and your workflow is to move things when they're done to the next branch, or to cut a release branch from main. I'm really which branch is which kind of doesn't matter, but having a branch per environment is a good idea.
I also want to clarify one thing. if in like the presentation it came across that we want to replace GitLab and GitHub and stuff with
No,
this,
not at all.
that's not the intention at all, because what you're talking about, GitLab, GitHub, they have that use case already. Like they automatically move things from a dev environment into like a deployment environment and things like that. You can configure that pretty easily to happen automatically as well.
So what it could look like, in your case to promote changes to test. Oh.
Yeah, I have another one in 15 minutes. So.
Okay.
I'll play with it. Thank you.
Well, we can tear down here, and I'm happy to keep talking with you in the back. I also have another presentation in 15 minutes, so. Yeah, but feel free to reach out through email, or I'll be hanging out at the reception after the last session today, and I'm happy to talk more. Sarmishta is too about any of this. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm also